Peaches had been fading for weeks, but only now did that decline become undeniable. Her voice had turned hoarse and then thinner and thinner, every sentence dragged up from the very bottom of her lungs, her breathing sometimes breaking, sometimes seeming to stop altogether, her thin shoulders trembling beneath the hospital blanket. The fire that had once blazed in her eyes, the very thing that made all of Fairmont Crest wary of her, had softened into a vague, dim halo, like a candle guttering in a draft, about to go out. Everyone who stepped into that stark white room could feel something slipping away, not hour by hour but minute by minute, second by second. Yet no one felt it more sharply, more painfully, than Leslie. All her life, despite schemes, ambushes, ruthless blows and endless acts of manipulation, the only anchor Leslie had ever truly trusted was never money, power, or reputation. It was Peaches. The woman who had reached out and dragged her out of the muck, who had raised, shielded, and forged her into a survivor who knew how to bite back before she was devoured. Now that woman was nothing more than a faded shadow in the stench of antiseptic, slipping further away each day from the world she had torn her soul to shreds fighting to gain a place in. Every morning, Leslie saw Peaches a little weaker. Every night, she sat staring at the monitor tracking her heart rate, feeling as if with every number that dropped, a piece of her own past was being pulled out of her body. Leslie, the woman who had spent her entire life sealing every crack beneath a layer of cold armor, suddenly realized she was splintering in the smallest of moments. It could be when she unconsciously pulled the blanket higher under Peaches' chin, even though she knew the nurse would be back in just a few minutes. Or when she absent-mindedly smoothed Peaches' tangled hair and noticed her own hand was trembling. Or when she jolted, because she heard the nurse whisper to Peaches in a soft, gentle voice, the kind of voice no one had ever used with Leslie, and perhaps the kind she herself had never used with anyone. The house that had always been noisy, always echoing with the clash of power, had suddenly fallen into a terrifying silence. When Peaches drifted in and out of consciousness, it was as if every other room had been emptied of sound, leaving only the nurse's footsteps, the heavy roll of the hospital bed wheels, and Leslie's ragged breathing in her sleepless nights. Danny, Nicole, even Tomas, people who had clashed, schemed, and gone to war with Leslie more times than they could count, all seemed to slow down, to soften. They no longer argued with her in the hospital corridors, no longer dragged old battles or old sins back into the light. They simply put a hand on her shoulder, offered a few quiet words of comfort, or just sat beside her in silence for a long time. Everyone understood that no matter how cunning, cold, or ruthless Leslie might be, no one deserved to face the loss of the only person who had ever chosen them when the rest of the world turned away, and to face it alone. At the bedside, Leslie clasped Peaches' bony hand and whispered apologies she had never spoken aloud, desperate pleas she had never dared confess. She asked for just one more day, one more hour, one more chance to say the things she had never had the courage to admit. Peaches, though her body was breaking down, still had moments of clarity so sharp they were chilling. One gray evening, when the last rays of sunlight were swallowed by the buildings, she suddenly tightened her grip on Leslie's hand. Her tired eyes were strangely bright, as if a curtain had been pulled aside. Leslie leaned down, thinking Peaches was in pain. But the hoarse, slow words that came out carried a different weight, the weight of something that had been buried for decades. Peaches motioned for her to come closer, then, with trembling fingers, reached for the nightstand drawer. From inside, she took out a small, worn envelope, its edges frayed as if it had lain there for far too long, hidden from both light and anyone's curiosity. Inside the envelope there were not only papers, but also a photograph stained by time. Peaches took the photo out first and held it tightly, her cracked lips moving as if she were wrestling with herself. Leslie glanced at the picture, at first just mildly surprised, then feeling her blood grow colder the longer she looked. She didn't need anyone to explain. She knew that face, not because she knew the person, but because of the haunting familiarity of each feature. The smile, the eyes, the curve of the chin. All of it seemed to have stood before her somewhere. Only younger, more innocent, not yet sharpened into steel by life. It was Haley Lawson, the woman who had caused no small amount of chaos in Fairmont Crest, the woman Leslie had chased, confronted, suspected, and at times, though she never admitted it, pitted. Peaches looked at Leslie and nodded slowly, tears sliding onto the white pillow. She confessed that the photograph had been taken when Haley was just a child, that this girl was not just some passing figure in Leslie's life, but Peach's own flesh and blood. Years ago, through a string of tragedies, mistakes, and desperate choices, that child had slipped from her grasp, vanished from her life as if she had never existed. Peaches said she had never stopped searching, never stopped praying that someone, anyone, would find her daughter, even when she no longer had the courage to face the truth herself. Now, with her time nearly gone, she could not accept leaving this world without letting Haley know the truth, without giving herself at least one chance to see that lost child again, even if only once. Leslie's heart shattered into pieces. Part of her wanted to soothe Peaches, to reassure her that everything would be fine, that there was no need to stir up the past. But another part, fiercer and brighter, flared up like fire. Haley had to know. That girl had the right to know who she was, to know how her real mother had loved her and searched for her. And Peaches deserved to hear her daughter's voice, to look into her eyes, to feel the living presence of the child she had carried in her heart all those years. The decision was made in the same moment while Peach's hand was still warm. Without hesitation, without calculation, Leslie shot to her feet and promised she would come back as quickly as possible. For one of the rare times in her life, she left a room not to orchestrate a power play, but to chase a fragile chance called reunion. Leslie drove like she was racing the clock, racing every fragile beat of Peach's heart. She didn't wait for visiting hours, didn't call ahead, didn't stop to consider Haley's fragile emotional state. The door to Haley's apartment shook under her urgent pounding. When it finally opened, Haley appeared with the usual mix of irritation and exhaustion on her face. But that expression froze the moment she heard the truth spill out of Leslie's mouth. In an instant, Haley's entire world tilted. The woman who had always insisted she needed no one, who kept everyone at arm's length, suddenly looked painfully small. She clung to the doorframe, staring at the photo in Leslie's hand and then at Leslie's face. The lines, the similarities, the eerie coincidences, all of it felt like sharp blades slicing through the beliefs she had used to protect herself for so many years. A single confirmation was enough to shatter every assumption about her past she had once clung to. When Haley finally stammered that the photo was real, that the story was real, another clock started ticking in both their minds. Peaches was lying there, on the edge between life and death, and every minute they sat paralyzed by shock was a minute stolen from their last chance to meet. With the part of her heart still capable of thinking clearly, Leslie pushed Haley. If she wanted answers, if she wanted to look into the eyes of the woman who had carried her blood but had never been allowed to raise her, then this was the time. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. So they rushed out of the apartment, carrying all the questions they hadn't yet found words for, and sped straight to the hospital where Peaches was waiting, or slipping further and further out of their reach. But death always has its own cruel way of arranging things. No matter how fast they ran, no matter how many times Leslie checked her phone, praying she wouldn't see it. Bad news call, there are some battles humans simply cannot win. That night, the hospital room door flew open under the weight of their footsteps, but the bed inside was eerily still. The green lines on the heart monitor had flattened into one cold, unbroken stripe. Peaches had slipped away just minutes before they arrived, taking with her all the words she hadn't yet managed to say to Haley. In that moment, Leslie's whole world shrank to a single point, a point made of guilt, regret, and the feeling of being left behind, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Peach's funeral was small but heavy with emotion. She had never been a woman with many true friends. Most of those who had once surrounded her had ended up as enemies, accomplices, or long-broken connections. The faces that showed up that day were few, but each person carried a different version of Peaches in their memory. An unofficial queen of power games, a terrifying manipulator, or simply the woman who had given them a chance when no one else would. Her absence thickened the air, as if some warped but vital pillar had been yanked away, leaving behind a void. Everyone could feel, but no one knew how to fill. Leslie appeared in black, her back straight, her step steady. Her eyes were red, but every movement still bore the ingrained authority that had become second nature to her. Each step toward the casket felt like a knife being driven deeper into her chest, but she refused to collapse in front of the crowd staring at her, some out of pity, others out of morbid curiosity, wondering what would become of Leslie now that the woman who had shaped her was gone. When she rose to deliver the eulogy, Leslie shed all her usual polish. There were no elegant turns of phrase, no verbal games, only raw truths about Peach's strength, and the fierce, distorted kind of love she had used to raise a child who wasn't even her own blood. Leslie admitted, her voice breaking for the first time, that every survival skill, every lesson in how to fight and how to love in a thorn-covered way that she possessed now, all came from Peaches. It was the only moment during the ceremony when Leslie's mask truly fell. When the funeral ended and people slowly drifted away, each carrying their own speculation about Leslie's next move, the whispers grew. Some said she would become more dangerous than ever now that no one was holding the reins. Others believed she would crumble, because her only anchor had vanished. No one foresaw what actually happened. Right after the ceremony, the funeral director approached her and handed over a carefully sealed envelope with her name, written in shaky but unmistakable handwriting, Peach's handwriting. Leslie felt the blood in her veins run backward. Clearly Peaches hadn't only entrusted her with the secret about Haley before dying. She had left Leslie one last message, a truth so heavy she hadn't been able to speak it aloud even in her final moments. The small envelope suddenly weighed on her hand like lead. Leslie could feel the weight of the past packed into that thin paper. Inside, there might be a confession, a warning, a name, a truth about her biological father that she had never known, or some other secret even darker and deeper, tied to layers of history she had never been allowed to touch. Stunned that Peaches had managed to prepare an entire final letter, Leslie suddenly understood. The bedside conversation, the photo of Haley, the confession about the lost child, all of that had been only the first half of the story. The other half, the darkest part, had been sealed into this envelope, timed for a moment when Peaches would no longer be here to face the fallout, leaving Leslie alone to confront it. That night, long after everyone had left the cemetery, Leslie was still standing by Peach's grave, clutching the envelope to her chest as if it were a weapon that was both threat and salvation. The night wind swept through Fairmont Crest, carrying the rustle of leaves and the whisper of stories that had never been fully told. In that moment, one thing became chillingly clear. Whatever was written inside that letter would change everything. Not only Leslie's life, but her ties to Haley, to everyone still living in the compound, and to the twisted history Peaches herself had helped create. The question was no longer whether Haley had made it in time to have one final reunion with Peaches. That question had become moot. The real question was, how many more secrets would Peach's last letter drag up from the depths of the past? Would it reveal the identity of Leslie's real father, digging up a powerful name capable of shaking the entire town? Or would it expose something even more horrifying, a dark connection between Leslie, Peaches, and people everyone in Fairmont Crest thought they already understood? In the darkness, only one image remained. Leslie standing alone, caught between a freshly heaped grave and an unopened envelope. And somewhere above the gloomy sky of Fairmont Crest, like a challenge hanging in the air, was the sense that once that letter was torn open, no gate in any sense of the word would ever close the way it had before.